Hey y'all, this is the Data Guy here with part two of my live debate with my friend Brian on the debates on the merits of Airflow and Prefect. So if you haven't seen part one, please go check that out. I'll flash a little card up on the screen. But if you've already checked out part one, get ready for even more action in part two. So without further ado, into the debate. The next one I'd like to talk about is scalability and performance. Sorry, the data dog is getting in my way. He's feeling extra cuddly today. And so I want to talk about, production workloads. Brian touched on, he's working on some crazy, crazy scale. But I'd like you to talk about maybe, how does Prefect scale? How does it handle these large workloads? What does it use for its compute? And just any kind of limitations or bottlenecks, or is it just all smooth sailing?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting topic that I did want to go over. So one of the things that I most like about Prefect, and here I'm going to describe the solution that we've built at my firm, which is based on the Prefect Cloud offering. So we use that for scaling the web servers and databases, etc. And that is a paid service. But I'd say the thing that I like most about that offering is that they have, I think they call it a hybrid architecture, is the term they use. And what that means is that while they manage the web servers and track the state of our tasks and our flows, they are not running any of the computation for us. They are not getting any of our data. We're responsible for running all of those jobs ourselves, and also running agents or workers to interact with Prefect Cloud to understand what flows need to be run, and then to actually kick those off on the correct infrastructure. What that means in practice is a few things. One, it gives us much more security and control over our data and our services compared to allowing a managed offering to run those jobs itself. And secondly, it achieves what I think as a pretty distributed architecture where once those jobs hit our infrastructure, we can scale it out very easily. So to back, as the compute layer that backs all of these jobs, we use a Kubernetes cluster on AWS that is set up with auto scaling capabilities. So as additional jobs come in from Prefect Cloud, our cluster will scale out to accommodate that increased demand. The agents and workers that translate these jobs into infrastructure running in our cloud are very performant, are not a bottleneck. So what that means in practice is that we can queue up tens of thousands of flows, and these agents will just push them out to our Kubernetes cluster, which will scale out very quickly to start running all of these things. And we'll be able to get through that workload, in half an hour, even if our cluster started from only 16 CPUs and needed to scale out to hundreds or thousands to accommodate that.
That's super interesting, Brian. And it's really interesting that you said, so you really like the hybrid architecture.
I do.
That's fascinating because we actually switched from hybrid to fully hosted because of so many complaints we got about hybrid, because are there not any security kind of concerns around the passing the messages from Prefect into the underlying resources, or because they're not actually really managing the provisioning of them, that there's no security risk there? Is that kind of, I guess, what happened?
Yeah, Prefect itself does not manage the provisioning of the resources. The kind of communication layer is through, I think they call it a worker now, fully open source piece of the architecture that is responsible for communicating with Prefect Cloud to describe the state of running flows, as well as to kick off new flows based on, in Prefect Cloud, if you have something that is scheduled, this worker will see that and then attempt to deploy it onto the infrastructure. But that worker itself runs on your infrastructure as well. So you can manage the networking, security, and everything else to really lock it down and make it secure.
Wow. Very, very interesting. Okay. So, I mean, what I'll kind of touch on here, it sounds like Prefect has really, it's a bring your own infrastructure model. There's not really any limits, for someone that needs to build out massive scale, as Brian does. You can bring that scale, you can manage it yourself, you can use your technical expertise that you have to kind of, make it more efficient, bring in AWS auto scaling, right? Service. Does your auto scaling work with AWS? Just curious.
It does.
Okay.
Yeah, we use EKS for our Kubernetes cluster.
Okay,
we
EKS,
scale
yeah.
out to primarily EC2 instances.
Lovely, lovely. So I guess to kind of talk about Airflow's approach, it is somewhat similar in that there is, kind of a baked in local executor set which, just executes one task at a time. There's a celery executor, which allows you to use a pool of worker nodes, and those worker nodes can be really anything, any type of compute, similar to how Prefect does. And then, with all these managed offerings, those will allow you to, just select, like Astronomer, like MWA, like GCC, you select which compute you want to do, you select the bounds of your node pool, and then some of those platforms will auto scale it, some of it won't. Auto scaling is one of the features of Astronomer, obviously. But it really is, it is a similar approach where, hey, whatever compute you need, I've seen people that are running 256 gigabyte worker nodes, and they're running 2 tasks on those, and it's just super complex. So really, you can bring whatever size small, so they're just using tons able to be adapted to whatever use case you're doing. The auto scaling, the auto scaling, depending on the platform, will work really well. The potential bottlenecks that actually have kind of come up over time are in the scheduler and the trigger. So in Airflow 1.x, I think, Brian, when you were still using it, you couldn't add additional schedulers or additional compute to a scheduler. So when you were running super large amounts of tasks, you would just kind of get up with your scheduler blown up. You'd have tons of tasks stuck in queue, and it would just be a huge headache. And so now with the introduction of the trigger, kind of an asynchronous scheduler that's able to do some of those operations, and the ability to actually scale the scheduler as well, you're able to now scale all components of the backend infrastructure so you kind of have that bottleneck removed. But they're also, with the way tasks get passed through the schedule and the trigger, making sure you kind of optimize that at really high throughput is crucial, because otherwise you can, at least with Airflow 2.7, finally you have the removal of tasks stuck in queues, so you can't just kind of get stuck with zombie tasks anymore. But before that, it was a really big issue where tasks would be just living in queue, never get started because they kind of be just in a zombie state. So I will actually give Airflow a 9 out of 10 on scalability and performance, because it does have a lot of capabilities, but there are some potential pitfalls that you can run into if you're not careful. Brian here.
So this is actually the first area that I'm going to give Prefect a 10 out of 10 on. I've been very impressed by the ability to scale out to arbitrary number of tasks and flows running. No bottlenecks. George, one thing I did want to ask you a little bit more about Airflow on this topic. So when I was using it, we had a single server that was our Airflow node, and this had a number of CPUs. It could run DAGs in parallel, and if we did want to submit, like, let's say, a SQL query, it would be able to do that in a kind of non-blocking way. But is it still the case where, for the most part, you are deploying this, monolithic server that hosts the UI, is running all the tasks and DAGs, even if parts of them are being executed elsewhere?
That is not the case anymore, Brian. So now you have in almost every Airflow that said I've seen a more distributed architecture where, yes, you could, run all the aspects of Airflow on one compute node. But at that point, it's like, why even use Airflow, right? So Airflow, in most setups, you'll have a celery pool of workers where you'll have your web server node, which will be just, a small node serving just, running states, your DAGs tasks. You'll have a scheduler node scale to whatever size you need for the amount of tasks you're running. You'll have your trigger, which is what handles asynchronous. You don't have, like, if a task is waiting for a state, that gets pushed to the trigger, so the trigger can just do the polling, and so that worker slot isn't taken up, so you can spin down a worker node if it's a really like, let's say, high powered Databricks job you're kicking off. Um, and so then that brings me to the worker, obviously, where you have as many workers as you need within that celery cluster. So you can set the bound, hey, I want to have, 50 workers all with one CPU and 2 GB because they're all maybe calling out to external tasks. Or I want to have 50 H100 GPUs all hooked up and I want to be running TensorFlow ML training workflows all in parallel, and all of that compute is pushed down to the underlying worker nodes. So the web server isn't like storing; it's just storing the information on, hey, this task is running or servicing any logs, but all the compute power is pushed down into the actual workers, and that's what it's able to scale Airflow and get you out of that monolithic setup. And that's a big thing we kind of talk about is the removal of monolithic Airflow and breaking out into many Airflows.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it does sound like you have the ability to build a pretty similar distributed and scalable architecture with either of these tools. It sounds like the main difference is probably that where Prefect has the scheduling of tasks distributed as well. The with Airflow, that is still run by that centralized scheduler process.
I think the next topic, monitoring and logging. So Airflow has some great built-in logging capabilities. I would say in terms of monitoring like the health of other services, as Brian alluded to, not really great at that, but it is really good at logging all the operations of what's taking place, wherever it's actually casting that operation. And so that allows you to just, read in all different aspects of your workflows. So, from your extracting from some APIs, into DBT, into your end visualization sources, and you can get all those logs served in. You have retrack capabilities. You have the ability to set states, so you don't have to reach, and also set alerting and notification capabilities on top of that, and then layer those alerts into all of the other services. So you don't have to use each platform's kind of individual monitoring or tooling for those kind of things. So I really think Airflow is a really good way of logging. I think it's monitoring could use some work, especially in open source. I think managed offerings like Astronomer do a really good job of bringing some of that monitor tooling in. But I think in terms of the open source monitoring, it's not really that great. We just introduced a cluster activity page, but it just shows you the health. It doesn't show you the actual information about what the nodes are. So I'm gonna give Airflow a 7 on monitoring and logging. It's the lowest category.
Used Airflow in terms of the logs. If you pulled the logs up for a DAG, it was really just a text snippet thrown onto a web page. Has that improved since then?
Yeah, I think it's task logs now. You wouldn't look at a DAG log.
But is it still just a text box rendered on a web page for the logs?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
But now you have the things that you can dynamically inject kind of like URLs. So it's like, hey, if you want to find more information about this, or you want to link to like where the breakage was in the downstream service, you can have it generate that URL or like service it from another platform, and then you can do like visualizations or pop out links from there. But at its most base layer, yeah, just render text box.
Okay. So I'd say the logging for Prefect is not its strongest suit, but probably a little bit better than what I remember from Airflow. You do have the ability to sort logs by timestamp, ascending, descending. You can filter by certain levels of the logs. But one thing that is lacking is the very performant free text search function. Now you have the ability to obviously pump your logs out to another tool that does provide that, but just built in with the Prefect tool itself, I would definitely like to see some better tooling around the logs. They can also be fairly slow to load, and well, they are introducing one new controversial feature to get some AI generated insights into your logs. Don't use that myself, although it does sound pretty interesting. In terms of monitoring, so in contrast to logging, I think Prefect does an excellent job monitoring tasks and flows. I think your standard observability is going to be pretty similar to what you have available in Airflow. But one of the things that I really like about Prefect is the very natural way that you can investigate arbitrarily nested subflow runs. So what do I mean by that? So if I have some, top level flow that is maybe doing some state synchronization and it determines that it needs to run hundreds of subflows, so invocations of different, flows that I've registered with Prefect, I have all of that available in the UI from that top level flow. So I can just click into one of those subflows and I'll go right to that flow run as well. I can, if that one has nested subflows, I can continue clicking through to get to the root of the issue. The navigation and the UI around observing your flows and tasks, I'd say, is definitely a strong suit. Most recently, they've introduced better top level views of your entire workspace. So, better dashboards around getting a quick understanding of what's the state of all my flows as I come in, maybe first thing in the morning and want to understand if there's any issues from last night that I need to resolve. That was a recent addition, is quite nice to use. So I'd say maybe to split this one, I'd say kind of the monitoring and observability is probably around a 9 for me. The logging, maybe a 6 or a 7. So I would give it an 8 overall.
Lovely, lovely. So now kind of running into the tail end of our categories, and I noticed they're decreasing in relevance here. Oh no, the camera, 1 second. So now we will wrap up with the last two. I'm just going to combine these. We're going to cut out the eighth one because it doesn't make any sense because I think Prefect and Airflow address the same use cases. But maintenance and operations and cost and licensing. So, Brian, I think you might actually have more insight into me and kind of the costs of Prefect versus Airflow and what that looked like for your organization at scale. So why don't you take away on this?
Sure. So I kind of go through a couple of different things here. So first off, in terms of maintenance and operations, I think Prefect does a pretty good job with this. One of the things they really try to ensure is a wide range of backwards compatibility between versions. So what this means in practice is we can run the Prefect infrastructure, those workers on our side, and maybe those are running older versions, but that's not really a concern for us. Those can run pretty much any version of Prefect that we've written our flows against. In terms of deployment, we package our flows as Docker images that get run on our Kubernetes cluster. So those are have a particular version of Prefect baked in, but we've really never seen an issue in terms of version incompatibilities between the Prefect that's running inside of our flow, the one that's running in the worker, or the one that might be backing Prefect Cloud. So I'd say the operational burden is pretty low. The only place where it really comes in is managing the infrastructure for the workers themselves and some of the more logical infrastructure like work queues or work pools that are part of the Prefect, more so the server itself. That is not terribly time consuming, but it does require an understanding of the infrastructure for Prefect. One thing I would like to see in this space is, for example, a Prefect Terraform module that would allow us to write those work queues as more infrastructure as code to allow us to manage that without any kind of manual, UI-based manipulations. So overall, for maintenance and operations, I'd probably give it an 8. It's easy, but not trivial.
And so I think for me, I will kind of split it for Airflow into two setups. I think your costs are just going to naturally scale with your workloads. I think Airflow is pretty good if you're using things like auto scaling. optimizing itself just naturally to the cost of whatever your pipelines are going to be. Obviously, if you're running some bad setups, you're just running a massive monolithic Airflow environment with 50 workers all the time and you're never scaling them down. I mean, that's just stupid. So I'm not going to say like that's a normal use case, but it is something that happens in the wild a lot. So Airflow can definitely, I think, is hard to get wrong, but if you do get it wrong, you can, just have really spiraling costs. However, I think those costs are most of the time driven by not like if you actually look at the attribution, you don't need to run Airflow a lot. So there's not a lot of, I guess the point I'm trying to make is there's not a lot of bloat around Airflow tasks. There's not a lot of bloat around, hey, that you're running all this compute that isn't actually doing anything. And Airflow is really good at also, offloading that compute to the downstream services that it's orchestrating so that you can get really cheap Snowflake compute for your data transformations, and things like, and, Databricks for your, analytics processing in Spark, without having to run a Spark cluster for longer than like 20 minutes. So you don't, have to sell your house for it. So I think Airflow is really good at, managing all this costs. However, the caveat of if you're using a management offering, then I think management is super easy. It's really almost trivial. But if you're managing an open source production Airflow stack, there's a story like there's a couple engineers at Airbnb that are getting paid millions of dollars because they just can't leave, because every time they try to leave they have to match their salary because they're the only ones that know how the Airflow setup was built. And so if you're not rigorously doing Airflow on your own and you have a full team like is documenting everything, you're not centralizing all that knowledge into a couple people, it's really good. But you can kind of fall in that pitfall. A lot of organizations do, because they'll say, oh, just have these two guys running Airflow. And even though it's powering half our data stack, it's just these two guys who know how to really run it. So I will give Airflow an 8.5 on maintenance and operations for managed offerings, and a 7.5 for open source Airflow, with an average of 8 for this final category. So I think that's the end of our debate. But Brian, any closing thoughts on Prefect or anything you want for the audience?
I think I'll just end with saying that they're both excellent tools. Airflow is a phenomenal open source project, and has had a lot of great contributors over the year. I think, as with any tool in a software stack, the more viable alternatives we have, particularly open source viable alternatives, the better off we all are. Because you may have use cases that are better suited to one tool or another, but as long as these things are well documented and it's easy for people to come to a determination about what the right tool is for them, more great alternatives with managed offerings behind them, if that's suited to your use case, is generally better for everyone.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, it sounds like Prefect is filling that niche for people that want to take off and do all their own infrastructure. They want to just go crazy processing tons of data on disk. They want to have their own custom workflows. And Prefect gives them kind of the security where they have that web UI, it looks like, but they're able to push or manage their cluster completely separately, isolated. So for big financial or companies, I think it's a great tool. I think Airflow is obviously the better tool, as I work for Astronomer, the Airflow company. I think it's just more flexible. I think it's got more potential use cases, and I think it's just a little more adaptable. However, to Brian's point, I think it's good that both of these services exist, because they do fit. They might at the surface cover the same kind of use case. They do have their own kind of niches where they are, a lot better. Prefect might be a lot better for, a lot of this data processing, because Airflow isn't really good at processing a ton of data on its own. You need to call it to external services. And if you want to do that on your own within a Kubernetes cluster, maybe you go and use Prefect. So I think that is a great way to wrap it up with togetherness and friendships. So Prefect and Airflow, better together forever. Maybe we can do a Prefect Airflow collaboration one day. I don't even know what the hell that would look like. But anyways, thanks for tuning in. Data Guy out. Peace. Bye, Brian.
Thanks for having me.